Hello, this is Tell Me More, where we go a little bit deeper into Sunday's discussion and sermon. And I'm April Beaver, the Director of Digital Ministries, and I'm here with Pastor Tim, who spoke on Sunday about Hannah and Peninnah.
Yeah.
And their relationship. And this was part 3 of our epic Bible rivalries. And so this was the rivalry between those two ladies.
Right. Yeah. We kind of take a look for the first time in the series at 2 women who have an epic rivalry. So.
Yeah, and it was, let's just go over the story just a tad bit. So Hannah was barren and wanted a son, and her husband said, "Hey, aren't I better than you to 10 sons?" And she didn't really take that very well, but went to the Lord. And through this is her rival, Peninnah. And Peninnah was goading her and digging at her the whole time.
Yeah. And again, we talk about these stories with some added information that's not biblically, textually verifiable, but Jewish tradition adds some of these details. And the Midrash suggests that Hannah and Elkanah tried for 10 years to have a child together, but Hannah could not conceive. And that Elkanah, who wanted to fulfill the command of the Lord to be fruitful and multiply, then brought in Peninnah so that he could have an heir. And again, there's so many parallels with the story of Abraham and Sarah, Sarah, of course, unable to conceive, so Abraham brings in Hagar. And just as in that story, the woman who is able to conceive keeps sticking it to the woman who can't, because Hagar really gave Sarah a hard time, so much so that in the end, Sarah kicks Hagar and Ishmael out of the house because she was so annoyed with it. So really layered stories, complex stories that have some cultural distance to our own situation, which there's so many sensitivities around infertility and things like that.
Another thing that's very different from our current situation is this whole multiple wives.
Right.
It seems like in the Old Testament, that's fine and okay. And here we live in a society where that is looked down upon, frowned upon, even illegal in a lot of instances. What's the difference? How is that okay in the Old Testament, not okay now? Well,
I'll challenge the last thing you said, because I'm not sure the Bible ever says, hey, this is a great idea. Because if you look at some of those stories of multiple marriages, almost universally, things go wrong. Things go sideways in there. I mean, the ultimate example is Solomon, who brought in 700 wives and 300 concubines, and it led to the ripping asunder of the United Kingdom. David has multiple wives, and he has problems there. So the Bible, I think, makes accommodations for place and time. And the books of Moses are really specific in how and why this can happen. For instance, some men have multiple wives because their brother has died, and instead of allowing the widow of the brother who has died to be on her own, raising kids, then the brother who's surviving would bring her in. That's something called levirate marriage according to the Levites. You would have multiple marriages sometimes because of infertility and the need to bear children. But we're so distant in terms of what we think about as romance in marriage. Obviously, throughout time, people have loved their spouses, husbands and wives. But marriage, because 2 people fall in love, go to the high school prom together, decide to get married because their hearts are united, that just wasn't the driving factor in legal marriage in the Old Testament. It had more to do with uniting families for tribal reasons. Again, in Solomon's case, for political reasons. There are dowries exchanged. Unfortunately, women are too often kind of propertyized, commoditized in that. So I think we really have to be careful saying, well, and we do know some people even in our modern era do this. so-and-so in the Old Testament had multiple wives, therefore it must be okay. Right. Read those stories carefully, and there's never like this great harmony between one man and his 6 wives. It just doesn't work out very well. So right. I would say that the Bible makes allowances, culture and place and time gave permission for that, but I don't think the Bible ever recommends it or advocates for it.
That's a very good point.
Yeah.
Like that. With the whole love and marriage, we saw a barren woman given a child but Peninnah, you'd mentioned, perhaps was longing for a husband's love. Is there anything in the Bible that addresses that, where the longing for a spousal love was not met, but then came to be?
Yeah. And that's a great question. And the answer is, I don't think so. But I also want to take a step backwards and say, when I referenced that in my message, I was speculating because the biblical text never says that Peninnah was longing for the love of Elkanah. That's an assumption that I'm making. And I think there are good grounds for it. Yeah. Everyone wants to be deeply loved by someone. But similar situation with Leah, we don't know for a fact that they pined away for the love of these men. They may simply not have had that as a frame of reference. Again, marriage for them maybe was more about the utility of having a legal connection and providing children for the community. But I can't think of an instance in which a woman was in a loveless marriage and prayed and prayed and prayed, and suddenly the husband fell in love with her by a miraculous act of God.
Right. Right.
Someone will email us and tell us that there was one somewhere.
Well, but I hope so.
Maybe somewhere deep in one of the stories of the prophets or something like that. But a lot of times marriage, you look at the story of Hosea too, it just works so differently than our marriage does.
Right. Yeah. God does supply the longings of our hearts, though, and it does talk about him putting the lonely into families. And so when he does meet those needs, it just may not be explicitly spelled out in the Bible.
And I think that's the broader point is that even if you do not have that longing for an earthly partner realized, that in some sense God steps into that. And I think that is an issue that does translate into our place and time as well, because having done a ton of premarital counseling and some postmarital counseling, this vision of the husband and the wife loving each other equally with equal magnitude and the same level of depth for the same reasons is rare.
Yeah.
And sometimes the husband just longs for the wife, and the wife doesn't have that same style or depth of longing for her husband, and vice versa. And those are the realities of life that pastoral care really needs to address.
Yeah. A lot of people I saw in church and online really connected with this whole barrenness thing. And I just wanted to talk again about the 3 things that you said. Can you remind me what they were? If you have a stressor outer, you can, what were the 3?
Mope,
yes.
Cope, or lean into hope.
Or
reach out and hope. Yeah.
And that, just on a personal level, that really spoke to me because I struggled with barrenness for several years. And when I was at my lowest, that's what God said to me is don't give up hope.
Right.
And that's just a beautiful way that Hannah reached out in hope, and something that we can encourage people to do wherever you are and in that depths is to reach out in hope. Now, what happens when that hope's not realized?
Right.
That's a hard place to be, but something that we can continue to talk to God about.
Yeah, and on that one, we just kind of come up on the precipice of tremendously deep and difficult questions that are almost questions of theodicy. Why are people who are doing the right thing not receiving the kind of things you would expect God to give them? And this passage in Luke 18, Jesus says to pray and never give up. Keep on praying and never give up. It might mean never stop asking for that one thing that you long for, or it might mean keep on praying, but allow what your petitions are to evolve in response to what God seems to be teaching you. So that, remember the old serenity prayer, like teach me to change the things I can change, to accept what I can, and to know the difference. And knowing the difference takes great Christian and spiritual maturity.
Yeah. And a good conversation with God. And a lot of times we have a tendency to tell God what we want, but we don't sit and talk with him in a way that lets our hearts then be led to what he wants.
Yeah.
It's an evolving conversation.
Yeah. And I might like to just say a sentence about the words mope and cope too, because I don't want those to be misconstrued. Moping does not mean that people don't get depressed and discouraged, because they do. People get heartbroken over these longings that are unrealized. And by moping, I mean where you simply tune out any attempts people make to provide care to you, listen to you, hold you, go into those difficult and dark valleys of the shadow of death with you, where you just say, no, I would rather just sit and savor on my problem rather than sense that there might be light at the end of the tunnel. Yeah. And by coping, I mean looking for the right answer in the wrong places. And maybe this is sort of the Hagar thing. God wanted Abraham to have a child, but he went to the wrong place. And by coping, there's all kinds of coping mechanisms where people just want the pain to go away. And so they paper over a pothole with addictive tendencies, just any distractions that can keep them from really going to the one person who can ultimately rectify the situation or rectify your heart to come into alignment with his perfect will. Yeah,
that's really good. I like those descriptions.
So being depressed and discouraged is not wrong. It's not sinful.
Right.
And needing medication or something like that, or needing to go for a walk because that's your coping mechanism. We're not talking about those things as being bad.
But getting stuck there.
Getting stuck there and not pressing into the best thing of all, I think it can be a challenge. And that's where really good counselors and therapists can help you.
Yeah, that's really good. So you talked that Peninnah was this difficult irritant towards Hannah. How do we know if we are that difficult person?
Do people walk away when they see you coming into the room? I don't know. Do they refuse to answer your phone calls? Probably there's some ways you can tell. But I think that part of Christian integrity is when you sense that there is some sort of fissure between you and someone else, when there is a roadblock or obstacle, to take initiative and say, is there something I can do better in this relationship? Is there something about me that is making this relationship more challenging than it should be for you? And taking leadership in that, volunteering. And part of just the whole idea of integrity is to ask people, what are the impact of my actions on you? Yeah. And after they answer, say, what else? What are the deeper ones? Right. Until you really have wrung that sponge out and really been able to come to terms with how your personality, your insecurities, your agendas, whatever it is about you that makes you might be nagging or annoying someone else. And some of those things I think we can work at. And there's some times when we're in those stressful relationships, it's probably better just to take a few days or a few weeks apart and kind of rethink that. Because there could be something that's in the person who's stressed. It's not in the stressor, but in the stressed person that needs to be addressed too. Yeah. Why does this bother me so much? Right. What is it? Are they actually just reflecting something that's unresolved inside of me that I need to address? Right. And so the problem doesn't exist solely in them. The problem exists in the, as it were, the spiritual ecosystem of both of our hearts and souls. Yeah, that makes sense. And that leads right into this next question on how do we make those relationships better? And part of that might be taking that break, but what else can we do to make it so our rivals are not really our rivals anymore and repair those relationships? Well, depends on how much time you want to do this Tell Me More video in. That's a general question, and I think I'll answer it generally, that the Bible knows all about stress. The Bible knows all about difficult people. And of course, first and foremost, we look at Jesus, how he handled stressful situations. I often think he must have just face-palmed all the time, stuff his disciples did or did not understand. The way that the Pharisees kept trying to trip him up. And so how he handled those things, of course, is the best pathway. We can do no better than imitating Jesus. Yeah. But of course, the Apostle Paul, who's dealing with congregational issues, especially in the books of 1st and 2nd Corinthians, those are really, really helpful models for us. And I think line by line studying and application of those kinds of things, Philippians, Euodia, and Syntyche are driving each other nuts, it seems like. And so Paul pleads with them to humble themselves and work things out. And then I think for me, I never want to stray too far from the fruit of the Spirit. Love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control, which are in Paul's writing there to the Galatian church, examples of how Christians do approach and address stressful situations. In fact, it's a contrast list compared to the kind of things that ungodly people do when presented with stress. Yeah. So the fruit of the Spirit is a do this instead of that, which actually comes first.
And then when we do those things, then those relationships can become restored and repaired and better.
Yeah. And I think that's the best answer that I can give in this particular moment, because the particularities and nuances of what's causing the stress are absolutely part of looking toward the solution there. And we don't have those in this person's question. Yeah. But is it stress because of a sibling rivalry? That's different from whether it's stress because people are both trying to impress the same boss, or if there's a stress that comes from, again, just a personality, a style of the way people interact socially. Those probably lead us down different paths toward resolution.
Yeah, that makes sense. And then lastly, you talked about the pearl and how an irritant becomes a pearl. It is kind of unique. Maybe God ordained that Peninnah's name means pearl. Right. So talk a little bit more about how the irritant can become something valuable.
Yeah. Well, what happens inside of an oyster is that when there is that grain of sand or that little pebble, or more often it seems like it's actually a part of the oyster itself that gets stuck in there, then God has designed oysters to layer that irritant slowly and repeatedly with this sort of the serum that kind of hardens. And over time, repeatedly, again and again and again, something beautiful comes out of it. So for me, the metaphor, beyond just the fact that there is this extraordinary coincidence with Peninnah's name, is that, we have to recognize that sometimes God does introduce irritants in our lives to make something more beautiful out of us. Yes. God sometimes allows stressor outers to insert themselves in our timelines, in our schedules, in our calendars, and sometimes repeatedly. And it's not because God's asleep at the switch or because God's trying to punish us, but because God's saying there's something beautiful that can only arise when one of my children rightly comes to me around a particular issue. And a pearl is not born overnight. It takes time over and over and over and over and over again. And of course, the more often this happens in the world of jewelry, the more beautiful and more valuable the pearl becomes in the end. In fact, there are some pearls that are, I looked this up online, worth millions. They're just not very round anymore, but they're just huge. And even today, people are trying to figure out how to artificially culture pearls. In other words, they make them. And it's not easy. It's something beautiful and unique. So I don't think that irritants typically lead people to become more beautiful, but they can if we follow the right pathway, which is to lean into God's provision and not mope and not try to cope through the wrong mechanisms, but find hope in Him.
That is beautiful. Thank you. So we've got one more week for our Epic Bible Rivalries. What's coming up?
Well, I'll be handing the baton to Pastor Mark Haverdank, who will be talking about Mordecai and Haman from the book of Esther. And these two were rivals in a way. I would say it's more likely that Haman saw Mordecai as a rival than Mordecai saw Haman as a rival. But two men who appear on sort of the outer orbit of this story that really places the brave woman Esther, formerly Hadassah, at the center. And we'll watch how they live in a time of intrigue and danger and racism in Persia.
Okay, sounds good. Well, thank you very much for joining us today, Pastor
Thanks,
Ken.
everybody. See ya.